Hey there, thank you for tuning into our podcast. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share. And buy me a cup of coffee, $5, $10, $15 a month. The link is in the description. Shalom and welcome to this episode of Did You Know? I'm your host, Rabbi Ira Brower from Shalom Boca Messianic Synagogue here in Boca Raton, Florida. And perhaps you've been hearing a lot lately on social media about the Christian Zionism, that term, Christian Zionism. It's been all over social media lately and being applied often in a very negative way. And so I thought this morning on today's podcast, we'd unpack what that actually means and how it's been misused in the social media airways lately. And so, you know, the meaning of words has different ways of being communicated. So we can go by what the words actually mean, but sometimes words, the meaning of words, how they're used will change over time. And so I always like to start with what does that word, what do the words actually mean? And then how are they used or how are they being misused? So obviously the word Christian Zionist or the term consists of two words, right? Christian and Zionist. So let's start with the word Zionist. What does Zionism mean? And obviously, or maybe not so obvious, is the fact that the word Zionism comes from the word Zion. In Hebrew, it's Zion. Zion. Well, what does that mean? Well, Zion, or Zion, is referring to the mountain in Jerusalem, Har Zion, the mountain of Zion, which is written about throughout the Scripture, in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Scriptures, or the Old Testament, as the place where God resides. Now, an ancient understanding of God and the gods, of course, the pagan nations worshiped gods, and those gods also always resided on mountains. Okay? Mount Olympus, where Zeus lives, and Mount Bashan, where the gods of Canaan lived, and so on. Well, the God of Israel wanted to reside and reveal himself on this mountain called Zion. Now, before Israel came into the land, God moved with Israel throughout the wilderness experience and so on. In the tabernacle, his residence was there, and the people would come, bring their offerings, so that they could draw near to God. Karov, we've talked about this in a previous episode. The word korban, sacrifice, comes from the word to draw near to God. And those sacrifices enabled the people to draw near to God. In the tabernacle at first, then they come into the land. There was a place called Shiloh, where the tabernacle resided. And eventually, under King David, was moved to Jerusalem, to Mount Zion. And so Mount Zion is a representation of the center of Jewish life for many, many years in Jerusalem, in the temple, the first temple, and then eventually the second temple. And so, of course, we know that there were two exiles, if you will, 439 BC, where the Jewish people in Judea, Jerusalem and Judea were scattered to Babylon primarily, and then regathered 70 years later back to Zion, back to Jerusalem, back to reestablish life in Jerusalem. That lasted for approximately 400 more years until the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. The writings of the New Covenant that we have, the Gospels, the letters, and so on, written, of course, by Jewish men, were all written prior to the destruction of the Second Temple. So what do we have? We have a Jewish people that were scattered to four corners of the earth, essentially, after destruction of the Second Temple. But lo and behold, were regathered back to the land in 1948 in fulfillment. Well, of course, the regathering started way before 1948, but Israel was reestablished as a nation in 1948. Well, how did that all happen? Well, it happened because of a movement called Zionism. Zionism, the idea of understanding that God promised the land of Israel back in Genesis 12 and Genesis 15 to Abraham with specific boundaries that to his descendants they would inhabit that land. And it was part of the covenant that God made with Abraham, that his descendants would be a nation, and that all the nations of the earth would honor the nation, his descendants, right? And his descendants would be a blessing to all the other nations, all the other families, literally it says, of the earth. And those that bless your descendants, Abraham, would be blessed, and those that curse your descendants would be cursed. And that promise and prophecy, if you will, has held true throughout the ages. For all the nations that have tried to conquer, that have conquered Israel, where are they today? Whether it's the Babylonians, whether it's the Persians, whether it's the Byzantines, they've all fallen, but yet the nation of Israel lives. Okay? And how did that happen? Fulfillment of God's prophecy, but he used people. He used people to bring that about. And there have always been those who believed in Zionism. And again, what is Zionism? Is simply the belief based on the biblical promises that God will fulfill his promise to bring the people of Israel, the Jewish people, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, back to the land. That's simply what Zionism is. Now, modern Zionism was brought to the forefront by a man named Theodor Herzl, a Jewish man who was actually a secular Jew, meaning he wasn't religious, and it just so happened that he was a reporter for a newspaper in Vienna, and he was reporting on a incident that happened in the very early, actually it was the late 1900s, 1800s, 1898, something like that, where a French Jewish officer in the French army was falsely accused of treason, a man by the name of Dreyfus, very famous case. And Theodor Herzl was covering it as a reporter, and he saw anti-Semitism in its ugly form because of this accusation. Dreyfus was convicted, sent to prison. He was publicly humiliated, stripped of his rank of officer in the French army, went to prison. Later, he was exonerated. But Theodor Herzl realized at that moment that the Jewish people had no homeland, and they needed a homeland. And that was the start of the modern Zionist movement from the Jewish perspective. But from the Christian perspective, it started actually the recognition of God's promise to Israel, God's promise, to the Jewish people. We could say started back in the 1600s, although the Protestant Reformation under Luther and later Calvin did not recognize those things because really they were still living under the understanding that God had rejected the Jewish people. But the Puritans, believe it or not, in the 1600s, they saw the prophecies and the scriptures related to the Jewish people's return to physically the land of Israel was yet to be fulfilled. And they believed in it, and that carried through the Puritans who came over to America, right? In the 1600s, the Pilgrims, they also believed the literal fulfillment was yet to happen, where Jewish people would be returned to the land. They saw themselves, these Pilgrims who came over on the Mayflower and later on, as a type of Israel, a type of the Jewish people, although they didn't see themselves as the fulfillment of that, not like a replacement theology, but they saw themselves as a type of fulfilling, of coming into a promised land, meaning America. And so that actually is very much built into the foundation of America, of the United States, this idea of a people coming out of bondage, which was the persecution under the king of England at the time. And they escaped, these pilgrims escaped and settled in America, and they saw themselves as a type of Israel. Well, fast forward to World War I. So for hundreds of years, the Ottoman Empire controlled vast areas of the Middle East, including what we now know as Israel. And of course, it was called Palestine for many years, based on the Romans renaming Judea as Palestinia, as an insult to the Jewish people after the Second Jewish Revolt in 130 AD. They were so frustrated and fed up with the Jewish people and the rebellions that had taken place that the ultimate insult was renaming the land after the Israelis' previous enemy, the Philistines. And that's where that name comes from, Palestine, Palestinia, the Philistines. And it was an ultimate insult. And that name held until 1948. But back to World War I, the Ottomans were defeated by the British and the coalition of the British, America, French, and so on. But primarily the British then took over a large section of the Middle East, which was called the British Mandate, which included modern-day Israel and Jordan and other areas as well. And in 1917, the British Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister, they were Bible-believing Christians. And they believed that God had a promise to Israel that was yet to be fulfilled in the regathering of the Jewish people to the land. And they issued what was called the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration, named after Lord Balfour, who was the foreign minister of Britain at the time. And essentially the Balfour Declaration acknowledged that Israel had a right to return based on the Bible. The Jewish people had a right to return to that land, which we know is Israel, and as their homeland, a right for the Jewish people to return to Israel as their homeland, as fulfillment of the biblical promises that God gave or made back in the Hebrew Scriptures. So that was a foundational document that eventually led in 1948 to officially the United Nations recognizing Israel's right to return to the land that was promised. And of course, Zion, the word Zionist was common back then, simply to refer to those who believed that the Jewish people had a right to the traditional homeland, not traditional, just traditional, but biblical homeland of Israel. Now, keep this in mind. Throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, the God of Israel is referred to just that, the God of Israel, right? Why is he referred to the God of Israel? Because of the promises that he made to the Jewish people, but that the God of Israel, this God that the Jewish people followed or were to follow, even though, of course, they rebelled, was to be the God of all the nations as well. So he's the God of Israel, but that all the nations should follow him as well, right? And throughout history, of course, we know the word nations, Goyim, Gentiles, many have followed him. And to this day, most of the Christian world, as we would say, are made up of non-Jewish followers of the God of Israel. So hence we have Christians, Gentile believers in Yeshua, who are, lo and behold, Zionists. Why are they Zionists? Because they believe the Bible. They believe in the promises of God to the Jewish people, and that they believe in the God of Israel. So whether you understand it or not, if you are a Christian, and by that I mean a Gentile believer in the God of Israel and in the Jewish Messiah, Jesus, who laid his life down for you, and you've received him as your Savior, by definition, you are a believer in the God of Israel. So now we have this misuse of the term Christian Zionist. Somebody named Tucker Carlson, and there are others who have now, in a sense, misused, misapplied, and misunderstood this very term. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Tucker Carlson has stated that anyone who is a Christian Zionist is a heretic. Wow. And he also said that he is horrified by Christian Zionists making excuses for the murder of Christians by Israel. He says he dislikes them, and he says they have a brain virus. So in these terms, and you can look this up, these are direct quotes from Tucker Carlson, and I used to be a fan of his, but no longer, because on the one hand, he calls himself a Christian, but I wonder if he's ever actually read the Bible, whether it's the Old Testament or the New Testament, written by Jews, right? But not only for Jews, but for all, right? And so for him to say that to be a Christian Zionist, you're a heretic, is to disavow the promises of God to the Jewish people and by extension to all the nations. Let me read for you one quote. This is from the book of Romans, chapter 11. The Apostle Paul, writing to primarily Gentile believers, Christians, and he says this in verse 25, "For I do not want you, brothers and sisters, to be ignorant of this mystery, lest you be wise in your own eyes." What is the mystery that he's referring to? He says it right here, that a partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all of Israel will be saved. Now, let me stop there just for a moment to remind you all that are watching that Jesus came first to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. That Yeshua himself is a Zionist. He never said, well, there'll be a time when the land will no longer be yours, and there'll be some ungodly people that will be here. No. The land, it was never a question of whether that land would continue to be inhabited by the Jewish people, whether they actually lived there or not. Of course, we know for 2,000 years they were in exile. We were in exile, although there were always Jewish people that lived there in Zion, in Jerusalem. And so that is not the question. The question is whether God ever stopped the idea that the land belonged to the people. And of course not. And he says this, that a partial hardening has come upon Israel, meaning that they, meaning the Jewish people, for the most part, particularly the leaders, had rejected Yeshua as the Messiah, but it was only partial, and there'll be a time in the fullness of the Gentiles, meaning the full number of the nations, recognize that Yeshua is the Messiah, and in this way, all of Israel will be saved. So there's some connection between the fullness of the Gentiles, the full number of Gentiles, the full number of the nations. It's not really clear what that actually means, but there's some connection between the gospel coming to the nations and, as a result, that all of Israel, Jewish people, not spiritual Israel or, the church. No, this is national Israel coming to faith. And then he quotes from Isaiah, says this, the deliverer will come out of Rome. Oh, no, it doesn't say that. Sorry. The deliverer will come out of New York. Oh, no, it doesn't say that either. The deliverer will come out of Zion. He shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. And this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. So there is a future, as Paul talking about, the deliverer. Who's the deliverer? Yeshua. He's going to come out of Zion because he's Jewish, out of Jerusalem. Zion is Mount Zion in Jerusalem. And then he says this, concerning the good news, they are hostile for your sake. Talking about the Jewish people. But concerning chosenness, they are loved on account of the fathers, the patriarchs. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. So listen, it doesn't matter whether you're Jewish or not Jewish. Followers of Yeshua, a follower of Yeshua or not, God's promises are irrevocable. And this idea that Christian Zionism is somehow heresy or somehow a virus or a curse or something like that is in itself heresy and an outright lie. Zionism is simply believing that God's promise to the Jewish people, physical Israel, and are still in effect. That the land that he promised is still there. Whether the government is following the Bible or not is irrelevant. It's God's promise upon the land. Okay? And for a Christian, a true believer in the Bible and a believer in the God of Israel would naturally and essentially need to be a Zionist, meaning to believe in the promises of God for the Jewish people, for the land. So if you have questions about that, please feel free to comment in the description, comment as well, and share. And really, let's keep the discussion going. And as you hear these statements out there in social media about Christian Zionism and being painted in a negative light that somehow it's antithesis to true Christianity, please remember that the promises of God are irrevocable, that God's love for Israel, the Jewish people, the covenant that he made includes the land, will always be part of it. The land will always be part of it. And just share that with anyone who criticizes it. That's it for today. Thank you for watching, and shalom. Hey there, thank you for tuning into our podcast. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share. And buy me a cup of coffee, $5, $10, $15 a month. The link is in the description.